Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Rural Affairs Rural Report. My name's Teresa Hoffman. I'm the Policy Communications Associate here at the Center. First of all, let me know you're here by saying hi in the comment section, and that's also the place you can leave your questions. Joining me today is Cody Smith, Policy Associate. He's here to talk about grid reliability and renewals. Thanks for joining me, Cody.
Hi, Teresa. Thanks for hosting me today. I appreciate it.
First of all, Cody, what happened in the middle of the country several weeks ago?
Essentially, what happened is that it got really cold, and it was cold for a long time. In fact, it got so cold that it was the second coldest week in some parts of Texas that they've ever seen. I'm looking at my notes here to show that it dipped as low as negative 19 degrees in northern Texas. If you've ever been to Texas, I'm sure that you can, recall that it doesn't typically get that cold. And, over the 3-day stretch that a lot of these cold stretches were in, they had an average temperature of 10 degrees across the state. And it snowed in all but 8 of the state's 254 counties. So really major weather event that was very cold with lots of snow, and it caused a lot of issues with the power grid across the state of Texas. Essentially, what happened is that because it was so cold and because there was so much snow, all sources of generation were impacted in one way or another. So essentially, coal piles were frozen so they couldn't scoop them up and burn them. Natural gas pipelines were freezing. Nuclear plants lacked the unfrozen water they need to cool their reactors. And wind turbines iced over, and of course, solar was partially covered with snow at some point. So it was a very tragic situation that happened, which left millions of Texans without power for a number of days. And unfortunately, the number of deaths related to the event, last number I saw was 68 folks had passed away attributed to the ice and frigid temperatures nationwide. So it was a very sad event. And there were several outages that lasted for several days, leaving people without reliable electricity and clean water to drink because their pipes were frozen and busting. Teresa, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, folks. Was one type of generation affected more than the other?
That's a good question. It really depends on the location, but the effects of the cold weather and the outages were felt across multiple different types of generation. And in several places, including specifically in Texas, thermal generation, including coal, natural gas, and nuclear, were more negatively affected. Basically, what happened is that the grid operator, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, you might have seen in the news recently, they had plans in place for peak winter events, but it was nothing compared to what happened. And so in some senses, it was a lack of planning and preparation, but in others, it was sort of one of these heavy, unpredictable weather events that have happened more frequently as a result of climate change across the country. In regard to, we saw a lot of narratives about it was because the wind turbines iced over or solar didn't perform as well. At one point, 40% of that thermal generation, so the coal, natural gas, and nuclear, was offline. Those are what's called dispatchable resources, meaning you can turn them on and off at any time. And it's kind of their main argument for having those types of power generation because they're reliable. Unfortunately, the weather impacted all of those because they weren't properly equipped to deal with the cold temperatures and the snow, which really led to about 40% of that being offline. So that was a very major event. Renewables were not without impact. In fact, wind energy, those turbines were performing about a gigawatt and a half less than what the grid operator had expected. But interestingly, at the same time, solar was overperforming by about a gigawatt more than what the grid operator had planned for. So renewables were affected as well. But by and large, the major effect is that those dispatchable coal, natural gas, and nuclear thermal generation points were offline from the weather as well. So as we look forward, renewables can play an expanded role in helping make sure that this type of event doesn't happen again.
Thank you for that answer. Cody, why was the situation in Texas more severe than in other places?
Texas is a really unique example of, a grid setup, and also, they are a localized grid, meaning that the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, is sort of it's a grid operator that's solely within the boundaries of the state of Texas. And, thermal generation fell pretty far short of expected output, as we just talked about. Texas, is managing its own grid as a state, and it's not part of those larger regional transmission operators or organizations. So for example, in Nebraska, where you're at, in Iowa, where I'm at, we are part of a multi-state regional transmission operator. You're in the Southwest Power Pool. I'm in the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO. Yours is SPP for short. And basically, Texas couldn't import power when their sources of generation, as we talked about, were offline because of cold temperatures. And part of that is because they made the decision to have, their independent grid in the state. So whereas, here in Iowa and there in Nebraska, we had some blackouts. My power was out for about 2 hours, but it was a planned blackout, and they were able to turn the power on back on after that, because they have a diversity and geographic location of where their power generation sources are. Wind was powering a lot of our electricity here in Iowa and in Nebraska, but we also get, in the one that I'm in, the grid operator that I'm in, it goes all the way up to Canada and all the way south down to the Gulf of Mexico. So it has a lot of geographical diversity in where they get their power from, and a geographic diversity in what those power sources are. So that's part of the reason why Texas was so much more impacted than we were in Iowa with negative 30 plus wind chill and temperatures as well.
How can this situation be avoided in the future?
I mentioned some of this before, but I think it's important to reiterate and revisit it. Part of the solution here is having more diversity in our electric generation resources. So, for example, more renewables like wind and solar, plus storage for solar and wind can be really impactful. And, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, we're making that energy, but we're also storing it in case, we need it in a later instance. Let's say the power goes out. We also want to make sure that, we are prioritizing a multitude of different resources and making sure that we expand the distributed generation of solar and wind energy and battery storage, as I just mentioned. For example, in Texas, there were a lot of homeowners and businesses who had solar panels on their roof, or maybe a community solar system that was coupled with a battery storage system, where they were able to weather those blackouts with little to no impact on their homes and businesses, because they were able to store that, making them more self-reliant, more independent. And that is part of the broader solution for a problem like this. Weatherization is another thing, making sure that the wind turbines in Texas are weatherized to handle those temperatures as they are here in Iowa. And the same goes for solar and other resources as well. I mentioned that Texas has a unique grid operator setup. One of the solutions here could be increased interconnectedness and planning to help improve resiliency and reliability between our grid operators. So whether it's ERCOT, as I mentioned, or SPP or MISO, whatever ones are working together, making sure that we have the transmission line capacity where we can import power when we need it. So for example, had there been better interconnection between ERCOT and MISO, where I'm at, they may have been able to import some of the power resources that we have to spare in our grid operator area. So that's part of the conversation as well. I think, one of the things that I wanted to make the main point about today is that this was a system-wide failure, and there's no one, silver bullet. It's not just wind or just solar or just natural gas. It's a combination of all of the planning, the distributed generation, and making sure that we have the capacity to respond to these events as they continue to happen more frequently and more often as a result of climate change. So as we look forward, we have a lot of opportunities to learn from what happened in Texas and make sure that we work together to ensure that it doesn't happen again, and that we actually make the public policy decisions and the investments that we need in our transmission infrastructure, in our renewable infrastructure, and making sure that we're prepared for the next event when it inevitably does happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cody, for joining me today. As a reminder, you can follow the Center for Rural Affairs on social media, where we continually share resources on this topic and others, and promote events that we are hosting. You follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and we will continue to share those resources and information through our social media and website. So please join us right back here next Tuesday for another weekly Rural Report. Thanks again, Cody, for joining me, and hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, Teresa.